All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the August 30th Gateway API Gamma meeting. As a regular reminder, the Kubernetes Code of Conduct is in effect for this meeting. And we have an open agenda that is linked in the meeting notes. So if there are any topics you would like to discuss, please feel free to add an item to the meeting notes section. And also, please add your name to the attendees so we can keep track of who is coming to these meetings and using that for future consideration in terms of planning the alternate time slots or consolidating perhaps. All right. So I guess the first thing that we have on the agenda today is GEP 1291. So this is focusing on mesh representation. I guess also as a reminder, we did successfully merge the first GEP 1324 on higher level mesh goals. That happened. Okay. Yeah, so if you want to take a look at that to see what we've gotten so far, that would definitely help inform kind of like what we're trying to prioritize for the next set of resources that we're trying to get in. And to kind of recap the discussion that we had during the last meeting on the other time slot, we had a few proposed approaches for mesh representation, and there was pretty solid consensus on moving the two proposals for reusing gateway into abandoned. So moving forward with an approach that is not one of those. Basically, the kind of consideration was that it could be confusing having a bloated scope and kind of like unclear usage patterns, and also would be potentially like an awkward fit for some of the non-sidecar meshes. So we have three options remaining for proposed approaches. I added a new standalone mesh resource based on some of the discussions we had during the last meeting, tried to capture some of the context around why that may be preferable to using mesh class or mesh class and mesh split. And then also added an API section to try to start moving forward towards an actual spec for this resource, like what fields should actually have. I guess I'll kind of turn it over to Keith if there's anything that you want to introduce at this point.
Yeah, let me, for clarity's sake, go ahead and start sharing my screen, just so we can see the.
Oops, I thought I was.
Document.
Sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Actually, do you mind sharing your screen? Because I'm your host. That's probably easier. There we go. Yes. So Mike, appreciate the work that you've done there. That's really awesome. I like the move to start thinking about API for this mesh this mesh resource. It's time. Lost my train of thought there. But yeah, you summarized the last meeting well. I guess what I want, kind of the gist of what I want to say that I'm forgetting the exact wording of, is I'd like to move quickly on this and use this forum to discuss implementations, or not implementations, but discuss any like deal breakers or pieces of design you'd like to see in tech, and just try to kind of collapse toward that's what it was. How do we feel about possibly moving this GEP right to implementable? There's a similar a GEP that's doing that with response header. Might not want to do that just because this is a newer piece of configuration, but I didn't want to throw that idea out there. I think the sooner that folks can start iterating on something like this, the better. And so it might behoove us to try to shoot for an implementable size gap to begin with, so that folks can get some feedback quickly. What do folks think?
And as a quick reminder, what are the alternatives to immediately mark it as implementable?
Good call. So we could alternatively keep it as provisional, and then we can still continue to iterate with it as provisional. I would need to double check the specific conformance implications of going marked implementable. But with Gamma as a whole, it might be better to keep it as provisional. I don't know, I need to double check some of those definitions, unless Shane or somebody else knows them off the top of their head. But there might be a rule saying that prevents us from going marked implementable for something like Gamma, in which case I'm totally fine. But did want to throw that out there and ask.
Could you ask that question one more time? I'm so sorry. Like I'm at a coffee shop and I keep getting scratchiness.
Oh, you're good. I've had issues with my headset, so it might be me. I was wondering if there's a possibility of moving something like this mesh representation straight to implementable because of all the different things that depend on it. But I also recognize that because of the kind of experimental nature of Gamma, that we might not want to do that.
But yeah, my inclination would be something in the middle. It would be like, it's okay. Just because something is marked provisional doesn't mean that you can't make a POC, something that works. You can start writing code. You just have to very nicely put it behind a barrier that says this is a POC. Like in my mind and in past, because I use KEPs locally at my current job and at my last job internally, POCs often become a part of the KEP process.
Gotcha.
What exactly would you implement with this resource, first of all? Second, I thought last time we agreed that this is kind of deferred and we don't have an agreement on the name. So remember that discussion is this resource is for representing multiple meshes, and we agreed that multiple meshes is not really what we want to tackle first because we don't really have a lot of things. And second is that we need to have some process to agree on a name because some people prefer mesh class, some people prefer mesh, some people may prefer other names. So I would hold on, first of all, proposing it until we agree on a name. And second, maybe implementable should be stuff that is not deferred. I mean, if you understand my concern here, there is nothing you can do with this resource. I mean, yes, you put a resource and what happened next. There is no way to determine what resources will use this mesh. And then if we use one, which is annotation or something like that, the implementers already have a way to use it. So I don't really see the practical use of this resource in particular. I will understand to move HTTP route, for example, to implementable if we agree where to attach it. But definitely it cannot be attached to the mesh because it's obviously the route refers to a service. So it's not really. So I don't know. Maybe I misunderstood last meeting, but.
So yeah, to answer one part of your question, I tried in the doc. There's 3 options listed under approaches for kind of like trying to like articulate the difference between naming something mesh versus mesh class and whether that's like 1 or 2 different resources. So there's 3 options there. We don't have consensus on one of those in particular being the thing that's decided yet, but we're hoping to get to that soon. And this is specifically on the high level. I have a mesh deployed to my cluster. We're like leaving the design space open, but explicitly not trying to do like, this is how you represent multiple meshes, this is how you do anything like that. So this is intended to just, at this time, represent a single mesh. That's the use case that we're trying to prioritize, but kind of like without foreclosing and expanding on that in the future. And then to your next point about kind of like services and HTTP routes, like that is in a different gap. That will be a different gap that is not intended to be covered by the scope of this one. This is just, I am deploying Istio, I am deploying console, whatever it may be, and this is kind of like global configuration or like cluster operator level concerns for how that should happen.
But what do I do? I mean, as an implementer of this specification, I see a mesh resource. What do I do?
Yeah, I think that's
it does nothing basically.
I think that's a great thing to add a section to this gap of like, what does this mean? What are the responsibilities of like, what should happen if you see this resource in the cluster? A controller should do it and should perhaps parse the config from parameters ref and apply that to an installed mesh configuration. Like, I think being explicit about what that intended functionality is would be really helpful to add.
But in order to have a controller, I need to install the mesh. If I install the mesh, I have the parameters already, so it's kind of a redundant things in the first place. I mean, for mesh class, there is maybe some purpose, but I don't. I mean, I don't know. If we want to spend the time by chaining on the name of this do nothing object, that's fine, probably because it's mostly harmless. But the important one would be the other one, which selects the enablement. So the one where you can put a workload specifier and which is per namespace and select that may be more useful in the for mesh implementers. But I'm not going to object to this because again, it doesn't do anything. It's not harmful, but except the name maybe because it affects the other one, which will
just to make sure I understand, Costin, you're basically arguing that if you install the mesh ahead of time, then the mesh resource doesn't really gain you anything. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes. Okay. Basically, to implement it, you need a controller, and the controller is already installed in order to process the mesh. So it's kind of
So I think there is a similar pattern in the North-South Gateway API that has that use case as well. Like one of the deployment models is configuring resources which have already been provisioned, as opposed to and a different model is actually provisioning resources from provisioning the underlying hardware or software from what is deployed there. So I'll see hands raised, so I'll turn it over first to Keith and then to John.
Yeah, so I think one of the areas of confusion here is, and we talked about this a bit in the last meeting, but there's kind of two different approaches to going about this, and at least two different approaches we talked about. And at a high level, they're the single resource use case and the double resource approach. And the single resource approach seems to be where, if I remember correctly, there seemed to be some light consensus heading towards a single resource approach. Forgetting names, gateway class, mesh class, what have you. From what I remember, the idea was that you could have two resources, kind of, with the typical Kubernetes parlance of, say, a storage class and a persistent volume, where one is describing one resource is describing kind of the blueprint of the thing being instantiated, and the important thing is that second resource, which represents the actual thing. The other approach is a single resource approach, which is, if I'm understanding, reading Mike's API design, that mesh standalone mesh option correctly, that seems to be kind of the direction that approach in the doc is going toward, the single resource approach, where there's a single cluster-wide mesh resource that represents a global installation of the mesh. And to Costin's point, there is some, it's hard to see the usefulness of that resource until you start thinking about things like deployment models and versioning and things of that nature. But I wouldn't say that resource is useless, even if you exclude our deferred goals of deployment models, multi-mesh, et cetera, because what that allows you to do is, even when doing something like service binding, you're able to show ownership of that mesh. You're able to do some kind of discovery of meshes, quote unquote, or of a mesh that exists on a cluster. But I do sympathize that it's a bit confusing because, to my knowledge, not many meshes have something like this already. The closest thing I can think of actually is the, I believe, now discouraged Istio operator approach, where you would create an instance of Istio operator, and the operator controller would read that resource to instantiate something like that. Kuma seems to have a concept of that as well. So I think there's definitely uses for it in over time, and I hope to discuss this perhaps in this GEP. But over time, it would be awesome to see, what kind of where the separation would be between the implementation specific, like mesh config kind of resource versus this general gateway mesh resource. So I said a lot of things. Hopefully that didn't make things more confusing. I'll turn it over to John.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know, I think kind of a lot of overlap, but it's almost hard to decide how we represent the mesh if we don't know why we're representing it yet. Like if we, in the service binding stuff we talked about originally, we had some examples where the route directly referenced a mesh. And if that's something we want to do, then it's useful, I think, to have a mesh object, even if it largely doesn't do anything. Like gateway class doesn't really do anything except for give a gateway somewhere to point to, right? And so, if we go down that route, then mesh makes a lot of sense. If we end up having routes not really actually refer to the mesh at all, then this whole kind of standalone mesh object that doesn't really do that much is probably less valuable. So not necessarily saying like we need to completely stop this. But it is helpful, like before we make a final decision, I think it would be useful to know how we're going to use it as well, probably.
John, the gateway class also tells the deployment part of the gateway API what to deploy, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not completely useless for sure, but it's just, it's not as useful as gateway or route, for example.
Yeah. I wasn't so much implying that was useless. I just wanted to make sure that I was remembering that particular dynamic correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit biased because we don't actually use the parameters, so.
Guys, okay, so I can give you a little bit more context how we use the mesh resource in Kuma. So yeah, we actually have a mesh resource in Kuma, which means that you can segment your whole mesh into multiple meshes and then have a mesh specific configuration. So all the policies are bound to a specific mesh and so on, right? So we have this multi-tenancy, which is like lifted above namespaces. And also we carry this concept outside of Kubernetes. So, I mean, if a mesh would not have this kind of multi-tenancy, right? That you need to group things into specific mesh, then I kind of agree that it's a bit useless to have this kind of resource.
All right, I see Costi is held your hand raised. Did you have something else to add to?
What happened? For the multi-cluster use case, let's say if I have cluster A, cluster B belong to mesh 1, and cluster C and cluster D is part of mesh 2. So I do see mesh is an important object.
We don't even see how didn't solve yet the problem for a single cluster, how to have 2 meshes. I mean, having multiple clusters will have to be solved absolutely, but
right,
probably
but then
as
a cluster A, right? Which mesh I belong to? Do I belong to mesh 1 or belong to mesh 2? As the organization, I have 2 meshes. I have 4 clusters. So I do need, as a, I'm in the cluster A, I do need to say, yeah, I'm part of, I'm going to use mesh 1, or I'm going to provide service to mesh 1. As a distinction, it's not like, there are multiple, as my organization, I have multiple meshes. It's not like just one mesh for the whole org.
I guess as a way to like try to move this forward, would it be helpful to, instead of focusing on concrete like spec stuff at this time, to focus on a section of like, what is the purpose of this? And maybe that ends up deferring this, and we like circle back to the like service bind to mesh thing first, if the usefulness of this is directly dependent on that. But at least that helps us kind of like get these ideas into one place. Does that seem like a reasonable thing that would help with this?
To answer your question, Mike, I think so. We seem to be in this interesting spot where we're trying to create, two very foundational principles of how we bind services to routes in mesh simultaneously. Yeah, a circular dependency chain, and I think that so two things that I think would be useful here. One, I want to clarify the meaning of a deferred goal for a bit, because I think that there is, folks might disagree with me here, but I think there's value in understanding that a deferred goal may be a use case while not digging into implementation details of said deferred goal. The purpose of deferring certain goals in that high-level gap was to try to prevent us from solving, from doing a bunch of scope creep and trying to boil the ocean and solve too much at one time. That doesn't mean that those aren't things that we need to eventually get to. So if we say, okay, we're going to need something to represent this mesh, even though the details of how we go about, if we need something to represent this mesh when it comes to multi-cluster case, even the details of how we represent said mesh might be deferred, I think we need to make sure there's space in the API to go about doing that. To kind of take some phrasing. So want to say that about deferred goals. The second thing is I think I might go back on myself here, because earlier I felt like it was time to get into API design for this resource, but as we're talking about it, to that circular dependency point, it's very difficult to have these as two separate conversations. So I'm wondering if perhaps having narrowed down some of the mesh representation approaches, and we kind of now have this core thing of what should this thing do? It almost seems like the service binding might be the more foundational gap, and it might be more useful to shift to that, at least for a bit, and kind of do this spot iteration of both until we eventually see a convergence. So apparently I'm really good at like asking questions and not answering them, and I'm going to do that here and let other folks with their hand raised weigh in. I think Costin, you had it next.
Oh, sorry. To answer to what was said about Kuma, I also mentioned in the chat. I think that's super useful. I mean, that's how I see the mesh resource being used as well. But it seems that the spec here is more like a gateway class, where it's a cluster-wide resource that has the implementation pointed to implementation, and configuration for the implementation is not the one we select. I think Rob also or someone mentioned last meetings that we should define first the concepts we want without putting names to them. And one of them being the class or kind of the implementation configuration, which is a per cluster resource specific to the mesh admin, to the cluster admin. And then there is the one we discussed about enablement. How do you specify that the workload is using a particular mesh? Again, with lowercase m. And again, it seemed Kuma fits in this category or what their intent was. And then there is how do you specify, a service attachment and how to specify example.com routes, which is yet a different thing. I'm very confused about what was the intent of this mesh object in the spec, because when I read the doc, it seemed like it's a cluster-wide admin specifies an implementation, not I want this namespace to use workloads in this namespace to use this mesh. The second one, I think it's probably useful and probably we should do it. I mean, when at last meeting it was considered that it should be deferred, but that's not a bad thing to explore now. But I'm not completely against it, but just trying to understand which one you have in mind.
So those are both options that are captured as two different possible approaches in this document currently. One is having mesh as a namespace resource to configure enrollment. The other is the cluster scope resource where the operator configures enrollment through a namespace selector or something like that. So there's UX options for like how it's implemented, but it's a similar goal of representing the mesh and defining how services are allowed to join it from the cluster operator perspective. And I think Flynn, you had your hand up next.
To me, the thing that, okay, let me back up. First off, Keith, to your question about perhaps we should shift over and look at service bindings for a little bit. I'm interpreting that as perhaps we should look at the concept of how we associate services with meshes and routes and things like that. I think that was a good thing to look at. With respect to the mesh discussion, I don't know, show of hands or something. How many people feel that it's particularly critical in the short term to support running more than one mesh simultaneously in a cluster? And the reason I ask is I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody actually do that ever at all, full stop. I'm sure that somebody must have. There's enough discussion around it that I figured that perhaps other people have found this to be more meaningful than I have. But I've literally never seen anybody do it. I've never heard anybody discuss it. I've never seen a use case where that's terribly desirable. And in that case, if you only have one mesh in a cluster at a given time, it really does feel to me that we should be able to skip ahead and look at how we associate services and routes and things like that, and accept that we will have an implicit mesh in a given cluster, which may still mean it's useful to have a mesh object if you just want a simple way to bind a service to an entire, or route to an entire mesh or whatever. But it may also let us simply sidestep that concern entirely at the moment and move on with getting to a place where we can have some implementable code.
Is the question about running multiple meshes of the same type of a mesh or multiple meshes, like, for example, Istio and Consul at the same time in one cluster?
Both from my perspective. Yeah.
Okay, so for the second one, well, the use case could be that you want to migrate to another mesh, right?
I agree. I've never actually seen anybody do that in practice with the same cluster. The only thing I've seen is people spinning up a new cluster to work with the new mesh, rather than running the pair of them in parallel in the same cluster.
So if you have enablement, then it is possible already to have two of them. So it's kind of, each mesh has its own, but let's not worry about it. That's the last thing to solve right now. First, we need to have one implementation, and then we can worry about how to migrate to the second one.
Right.
I'll bring up this from John in the chat. that the ability to be able to say this route is for mesh, not gateway, is very important. And I think that was actually the genesis of this mesh representation conversation, because we sense the ability to do that.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I wasn't here last week. The week before that, I thought that point about a route being for mesh, not gateway, was still under discussion. But that being said, yeah, I agree that it sounds like it definitely sounds desirable to be able to make that distinction.
Yeah, I agree. And thinking back to your point, I think that if that's the problem we're trying to solve, is how to distinguish a route, or how to say that a route is for mesh, not gateway. We're already talking about the routing API and how we're binding things. And that probably seems like a more appropriate place to have that conversation.
Yep.
So trying to capture the current state and takeaways here is working. It might be helpful to, instead of trying to like block on getting this merged first before moving on to service binding, to try to work on them in parallel towards convergence. Trying to add a section on like the UX of this mesh object in terms of understanding how it would or could be used, and also how it would or would not interact with other methods of deploying a mesh, whether that be an operator, whether that be a Helm chart, whatever it is, how one could express configuration through this object versus that kind of existing pattern. And then try to shift focus back over towards the like service binding HTTP route kind of discussion, because that seems to be what necessitated, like the direction I was going is what necessitated the creation of this. So if we can move that forward, then that might help it to make it more evident what purpose this plays. Is that a reasonable kind of recap of where we're at?
Sounds like it to me.
I'm behind on chat. Is there anything in chat that is worth bringing up at this point?
I think we're starting to discuss the how do you attach HTTP route to the mesh. I think that was kind of the reason why the mesh was introduced, and kind of the so parent ref in HTTP routes should refer to something other than gateway in order to be bound to the mesh. And do we need to introduce this mesh object just for the sake to have something to put in parent ref? Can we put some magic value? Can we put the service itself? Can we leave it blank? Because it seems that to make progress to implementation would be, the most important thing will be, hey, I have an HTTP route. I know HTTP route is specified. I know how it should work. How do I make it work for the mesh?
Yeah, I think we also, one of the good thing about Gateway API is it has very clear definition about persona. As a gateway, who owns the gateway is normally cluster operator. And as an application owner, I own the HTTP route. So I think we should follow that kind of model, the persona model. As operational, as the owner of the application, right? I own the HTTP route. I only need to define one HTTP route. I define how to get to my backend. It doesn't matter whether I'm linked to a gateway or linked to a mesh. And the mesh, I personally believe, it should be owned by the cluster operator.
Yeah, I agree. I think those personas are really helpful for thinking about it. And I think that's also kind of the common pattern we've seen of a cluster scope role for deploying a mesh. And then app developers control granular routing for their services that they own. Well, all right. I can kind of take the lead on trying to add a section to the mesh representation gap on the like what is the purpose of this object, and also just like I don't have all the answers. I would love to hear from other implementations about how it may or may not interact with different deployment models, including such things as would you use a parameters ref configuration object or not? Because it sounds like even for gateway APIs, some implementations don't use that currently. So that kind of context is good to know. And yeah, I'm unsure if the existing service binding gap, or if we need to start a third doc for the like HTTP route to mesh binding. But it sounds like that's where we'll try to like async collaborate on figuring out how to start getting more of that kind of put together. Next item on the agenda, Keith, you got a question about usefulness of this specific time slot?
Yeah, and right before I go into that, by the way, do I sound better? I had some folks have some issues hearing me. Do I sound decent?
So far, so good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so one thing I wanted to add is I just put the link to the mesh service binding gep in the Zoom chat. So that's a good place to start. I wrote it initially, but spent most of my time on mesh representation. Would love folks to contribute their perspectives on that gep, and try to, of course, add my own as I get time. But yeah, as far as my agenda item on the usefulness of this time slot, so just wanted to get a pulse for how folks are finding this useful, this alternating time slot thing useful. This is our third meeting at this time slot, I believe. We've been meeting with Gamma for about a month, a little bit more. And are there people here who wouldn't be able to make it to these meetings if we didn't have this early time slot? Would folks prefer the 5 or the 3 p.m. Pacific time time slot all the time, like the upstream, like the general gateway API meeting? Just want to get some opinions here on the usefulness, how folks found this useful.
This time slot is great for me. It's better than the later one.
Same for me on East Coast US time.
Yeah, this time slot is so much nicer for me than the later one. And again, East Coast in the US. Yeah. The later time slot I can often make, but on the other hand, the later time slot also runs into a ton of stuff with family. So being able to commit to reliably make that every other week is, yeah, that's pretty challenging. That being said, the West Coast of the US, it's a little trickier, right?
I don't think everyone on West Coast wake up at 10 or 12 and.
Well, I mean, the other thing, in all seriousness, like if you were to move this one an hour later, how does that affect people in Asia Pac? Because that would still be fine on the East Coast, and that would probably be better on the US West Coast. But I don't remember what time it is in China right now, for example.
Sorry, I missed a lot of what was just said. I realized that the spottiness with my sound was due to my internet connection. There's some cut fiber in my neighborhood, so I missed like all of what just said. But based on the notes, it seems like a lot of East Coast folks prefer this time slot. It's a bit more difficult for the West Coast. Man, I can sympathize with that. Is there? Oh, did I miss a question that somebody asked?
Oh, just mostly try, and we can ask this in Slack as well, but just trying to get a better sense of if there are folks in Europe, for instance, who would be unable to attend these meetings at all if we move away from this time slot, or if we move this an hour or two later, if that would unduly impact folks further east who may wish to attend this. Yeah, I'll capture this in notes and I can put some in Slack in terms of collecting feedback on this. But in general, it sounds like it's nice for US folks, US East Coast folks to have this time slot, but it's definitely difficult for West Coast.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
You know, notes in the chat to the tune of, "Oh, don't forget about Central Europe. It's late in the day there." And yeah, that's an excellent point. We shouldn't move this any later.
Awesome. Appreciate the feedback. And I know the Shane, I think you had the agenda item a couple weeks ago about the possibility of this time slot for the regular Gateway API meeting. Does this feedback help?
Yeah, it does.
Awesome.
Although I'm not exactly sure how many people here. I know at least I haven't seen Flynn at the regular Gateway meeting, but I know the most.
Fine, rub it in.
So my point just being, and then I picked on Flynn. My point just being, still not sure like how much cross meeting, like how many people are actually going to go to both kind of thing, and how many people would start showing up if we had an earlier Gateway one. We'll keep looking at it, but it's interesting to note that a lot of people like this time slot for this meeting.
The Gateway API meetings, I went back after the first time Shane was mocking me for not being there. I went back and was checking out the calendar, and yeah, the Gateway API meetings are largely impossible for me right now because either they're conflicting with family stuff, or they're conflicting with the Envoy Gateway meetings, or they're conflicting with this. So, or maybe it's just
Gotcha.
this and not the Envoy Gateway, but logistically, yeah, the Gateway API, it's really not possible for me right now.
You'd probably go then if it was at a more reasonable time. Or
I would certainly look into it. Yeah, it's
okay. Because I have two coworkers right now who work out of Poland who are both interested in coming, but the time is
not
too
at 11
late
p.m.
Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Like just differentiating between subject matter focus versus time zone focus. Of it's possible some folks are just interested in Gateway API for mesh, and that's why it makes sense for them to join this meeting and not the general Gateway API one at this time.
I mean, in my case, I ended up joining this one because, hey, look, I'm now working at a service mesh company, and it makes a lot of sense to be looking at how how Gamma will impact what we choose to do with Linkerd, especially since everybody probably saw that Linkerd already implemented in 2.12 some Gateway API stuff. As I am doing this, Shane, it's definitely bringing up things that I would like to clarify or possibly change in the Gateway API. And so, yeah, I would be interested in starting to chime in there.
Okay. Yeah, and by the way, I wasn't trying to give you shit. I just was thinking.
Yeah, you were, and that is fine.
I wasn't. It was more like I'd like to see you at the meetings, and I noticed you're one of the people I know that stands out that I haven't seen at the other meetings. So
yeah, Keith, that's a terrible pun, and yes, yeah. Oh my God.
But yeah, I'm gonna keep pushing. I think for that meeting to get some kind of not at that one time all the time slot.
I know that some of the folks at the Envoy Gateway meeting have commented that they find the ping pong difficult. I sympathize. At the same time, I tend to feel that for anything that is going to get the kind of global usage that anything in Kubernetes is, I don't think it's actually functional to pick just one time, because it's not possible to pick a time that works well across the globe. And so I feel like we really kind of just need to get accustomed to the ping pongs and asynchronous communications and things like that. Yeah.
or even start innovating ways to streamline that as opposed to trying to avoid it. I think there are probably so many smart people working on what we work on. There are probably ways to make things go smoother if we want to accept that reality. But
getting used to it can certainly include making it better, right?
Absolutely. And I, for one, really enjoy having folks who are able to spend more time and focus on these in these meetings, since it's not at a inconvenient time slot like late with family stuff, or folks in Central Europe. I mean, the name on the calendar is the EMEA friendly time slot, and I really value the contributions and attendance of folks there as well. So that's my 2 cents. But again, really appreciate all the feedback there. If you've got other feedback, feel free to let us know in Slack or ping me directly if you don't feel comfortable saying it publicly. But yeah, really love all the feedback from folks on these meeting times.
All right. So I have one last question before we wrap up. Was there a decision on KubeCon in person? I remember there had been some discussion about trying to gather Tuesday, I think, like pending the Service Mesh Con schedule.
Yeah, I didn't see a decision on that one. I still think it's a good idea, but
I think Tuesday afternoon was the proposed time slot or Tuesday evening.
Tuesday late-ish anyway.
Tuesday late-ish, yeah, something like that.
I think the Service Mesh Con schedule should be out soon-ish, so maybe we can work with that.
So we got a couple minutes left, and there's nothing else to go over, right?
Yep.
I don't think we necessarily need to talk about it right here and right now, but I would like to dig in a little bit deeper on the idea of like how to POC when gepping, because it's made me think that that would be a good thing to kind of have provisions for. On the other hand, if we just need to get your thing to implementable and like start building the thing and say that it's, part of the actual experimental API, that's potentially fine too. I don't want to get in your way, but
I am a big plus one to that. I think like that's one of the things that I am hopeful will help us get from kind of theory about how this might work to this is a thing that can work in practice for at least one or more implementations.
Yeah, I guess then maybe the conversation just needs to be, can something be experimental, but we don't say this is the completely agreed upon thing yet? That's what we're really trying to decide, right?
I thought that was the purpose of experimental.
Yeah, I guess it is.
I mean,
but
implementable
kind of has all the consensus has been built that we're going in this direction kind of connotation.
So maybe we don't mark it experimentable and we play with it anyway. That's
kind of what I'm just thinking about. But end of the day, we have the provision for experimental. If everybody's if nobody's like opposed to us saying that something that's still provisional can be an experimental, then that's all we need. That's all the runway we need to start building something.
So to phrase this as a question, experimental explicitly allows backward incompatible changes at any point, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So it's kind of the current provision. I just think that it's never really been. We've never really exercised the idea of having something that's like provisional and we might really change everything about it getting published as something that people could potentially like. The side effect of experimental right now is that even though it could change, most people are not most people. There's lots of implementations going on into experimental. So at Kong, we're implementing as much of experimental as we possibly can, right? So it's not something I guess we need to spend a ton of time over. I'll think about it some more, but at the end of the day, if we're close to ready to call that thing implementable, let's not hold on that. Let's just call it that. How many people in here are gonna like, as soon as something hits like if we were to do it that way, I mean, is everybody in here ready to start implementing that? Like, is everybody here ready to wants to start experimenting once we have like real APIs and stuff like that written down? Or is everybody, what's the appetite for like jumping right on top of this stuff as soon as it hits the ground versus waiting a little while and seeing what shakes out?
It's actually far better to have implementations going parallel, because that's how we find out problems with the implementation and with the specification. And for the servlet, it was kind of the same thing. Vendors moved along with the spec. But I wanted to point that HTTP route is not experimental. I mean, we may disagree about how to call the parent ref, but everything else, it's pretty stable. It's beta, and parent ref is part of the specification. It's just we may differ on what we put there, but everything else, policy attachment, and pretty much all other aspects of the specifications, I think we have more or less consensus that we are going to reuse what is defined in Gateway API. So we could have almost complete functional implementation, and I think there are a few already. So
yeah, but we also have like the experimental version of it, which we can tweak. Never mind, I'll shut up about this. But at the point where Keith, you or anybody else feels like you're getting blocked, I guess just start making noise about it, and we'll find the shortest path to ground.
That sounds cool to me. I do want to call out to Costin's point. Gamma is an interesting initiative here, because like 60 to 70% of what we're working on here is semantics around things that are separately versioned. So HTTP route is already at a certain level of stable versus experimental and alpha, beta, gaps run are implementable, etc. But what we're changing, in some cases it will be really nice, but in some cases we might not even be adding fields. You might not be changing resources. We're just adding semantics on how these things should be interpreted. And it's almost like, because of the kind of how we're trying to move with Gamma, like it's almost like there's a it's a temptation to version those separately, or not intentionally, but like that's a negative connotation. But like there's the ability or the thought to maybe version those separately than the actual resources around which we're defining semantics. I think that sentence makes sense. But to take the HTTP route case, let's say we use parent ref to refer to a service. That idea for binding, is that experimental, or does that go straight to stable because HTTP route is stable? Does Gateway API even have a mechanism to distinguish the two? It feels like that's where the get process plays in, because you've got provisional, implementable, et cetera, for the status of that gap. But I don't know if you've got like experimental, to Shane's point, experimental implementable gaps for semantics on top of stable resources. That matrix gets a little funky when trying to talk about like deprecation and API compatibility promises and such. So it's a weird state to be in.
It's not so funky. I mean, the Gateway API defines vendor extensions. That's pretty much what everyone would do. I mean, it's a vendor-specific policy. It's a vendor-specific, because parent ref, it's any resource. If it's a vendor resource, then it's a legitimate extensions. Maybe a bit abusing the concept, but it's not, unforeseen by the specification.
I think it definitely is easier if it points to a thing that is in an experimental channel and like has its own gap. And but I don't think it's blocked by like you said, like there is that vendor specific kind of or implementation specific out. So. Yeah,
it does feel a little bit strange to me to think about the case where you have something running, you decide to install a Gamma mesh into a cluster that, say, didn't have a mesh beforehand. It would feel strange to me to suddenly go, oh, now you have to change the version on all of your existing HTTP routes to be able to play with this, just for the record, right? Or if you were running, say, the non-Gamma version of Linkerd and decided to swap out to the Gamma version of Linkerd, again, same sort of thing. It would feel a little bit weird if you had to go through and touch all the configuration of your cluster to make that work.
That's a good point. We should add that as a goal for whatever document we do for HTTP route usage of like should not require reconfiguring existing ingress.
I think we kind of have to, I feel like there may very well be cases where we need to balance that against, oh, we're about to change the semantic in a way that will surprise people. But I don't know what those cases are yet. I just feel like some of them are likely to come up, and not wanting to change the cluster's configuration does not, for me, necessarily, it doesn't outweigh the idea that you also don't want people to suddenly be surprised when everything changes out from underneath them, right?
Yeah, and hopefully some of that can be resolved by just having explicit references to this is bound to the mesh versus this is bound to a gateway.
Or something along those lines.
Or something similar to that, yeah. All right, well, I think that's about out of time. We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for participating, everyone, and hopefully we can try to iterate on these docs in the meantime before the next meeting. Thanks again.
I'll post the mesh service binding doc in Slack with a kind of short blurb about what you want to do with it.
Cool, and we'll get that added to meeting notes too. All right, thanks everyone, and have a good rest of the day.